something you don't see every day. The Jeep, no warning lights. He's over torquing the other side. One thing we noticed is that the boot on the lower ball joint on both is cracked. That is not fixable, so that's being added to the list, but we're not going to tackle those today. Does mean another alignment though, but we're going to set this one off for just a little bit.
This is all just the reverse of disassembly, one step at a time.
And while he's doing that, I'm going to run into the auto parts store to pick up some reserved ball joints to add to this particular project. Yes, it's scope creep, and we weren't thinking we were going to do them, but may as well get it all done and only do one alignment.
New strut cartridge inside the assembly. Okay, so what I've done is I've raised the control arm up a little bit so that I can get a little bit more space to get the shock up and through, up into its holes on the other side.
One on, two on, it should dangle.
You got them down to like finger tight.
1, 2.
Just like taking them off, these back ones are in kind of a awkward and challenging place to get to.
A combination of mini extensions and a torque wrench, torque to 80 foot-pounds, gets those bolts tightened up.
And with that, the contents of the engine compartment have been reassembled. We still need to bleed the power steering for the new pump or for the new rack. But we will do that after we get through putting the front suspension back together.
Inspector Flashy says it's not done yet. Why are we quitting? Yeah, it's because it's 7 o'clock at night and we're both hungry. Picking this up in the morning.
So before we put this thing back together, we want to go ahead and preventatively replace this ball joint, because to replace that later, we have to tear this all apart again. And we know with that open to the elements, it is only a matter of time till the ball joint fails. To accomplish this, we're going to need to separate the ball joint here from the lower control arm, and hopefully let the lower control arm drop. I'm going to try to do this without disconnecting the sway bar just because, but if that proves not to be convenient, we'll have to go ahead and take the sway bar end link off as well. We will need to pull the spindle nut and push the half shaft back out of the unit bearing. And we will probably need to go ahead and take the brake caliper off just so that we can get a little bit more access to move things around. I'm going to try to replace the lower ball joint without removing the unit bearing, just because less that we have to tear down, the less we have to put back together. And I don't think, based on where the unit bearing sits back in here, that it's going to be in the way of pushing the ball joint back out of the knuckle. So with that, I think we're into teardown. I'm going to start by removing the brake caliper, removing the bolt or the nut for the spindle, making sure the spindle will slide back out, and then we'll take the ball joint apart. So we've now removed the spindle nut, removed the brake caliper, Brake rotor is sitting on the floor over there. We've separated the lower ball joint. This is the guy we need to replace right here. This is our replacement joint. And so, confirming the way this presses in, it presses in from the top. So it'll need to press out in this direction. The new joint is a greasable unit from Moog. So this will actually be a little bit higher quality, maintainable unit. So replacing the old joint here, which is a knurled setup, with the new joint that is also a knurled joint. So these appear to be compatible. They appear to be roughly the same size, shape, dimensions. Everything looks good. So the new ball joint is greasable, has this grease zerk. So when you put the joint in, you need to make sure you're placing the zerk into a position that is going to be accessible. Knowing that the brake caliper sits here, I chose to orient this forward so that it'll be accessible from the front of the vehicle. It just needs to be inserted and then tightened down. Ball joint's installed, grease zerk is installed. Now we just need to put all of this back together. So what we're going to do is bring the knuckle back out, orient it appropriately. Our half shaft here is still covered in anti-seize. So we just pull this out, line the half shaft up from the back side, and drop the ball joint back in its hole. And we just tighten everything up. Brake caliper bolts. You don't want these to come loose, so a little bit of Loctite. That is for the brake caliper bracket on this vehicle. Trust me, everything does line up eventually. You want to pay attention to the orientation of your brake lines. Make sure you're not wrapping them behind something that's going to cause havoc later. To finish the installation of the new shock, we need to put our clevis and this spacer back in place on the vehicle. The spacer is pretty straightforward. It just slides up over there. We need to work the clevis in here into position underneath the lower control arm. I think that is going to require that we disconnect the front sway bar in order to get enough space to work. Just going to start this upper one loosely because I want the clevis to be able to slide upward a little bit to match the top of the shock. So we'll wait to tighten this until we can put the weight of the vehicle on the clevis. Use of a floor jack under the control arm can help you get the control arm lifted up to be able to start the ball joint. This is necessary because there is a little bit of tension under the spring on this system. This is simply a matter of tightening it up and then torquing to 60 foot-pounds per the factory spec. So now that we've got some weight on this and we've compressed the spacer in here, we're going to go ahead and torque down the bolts on the clevis. The upper is a 45, the lower is 110. Reset the torque wrench to the much lower 45 foot-pounds. Now reaching the point where we're ready to put the tie rod end back on this. When you're doing a tie rod end replacement, the easiest way to get them close to being in the same place they came off is you count the number of turns. Doesn't hurt to also measure, but count the number of turns from the end of the rod. So in this case, it's 20 turns in. 1, 19, 20. Again, this doesn't have to be exact because we are just going to take it into an alignment shop. The idea is to just get it vaguely close so that the vehicle can drive itself either to the alignment shop or up onto the trailer, as the case may be. Now, tie rod end into the hole. And snugged up and torqued to spec. So occasionally you'll have a problem where the ball joint shaft wants to turn. So you just attach the appropriate tool to it so that you can hold it back while you snug it up. Once it's under tension in the knuckle, it'll tighten up and you'll be able to torque it appropriately. And this one wants 80 foot-pounds. So taking a minute, the last thing we need to do, we've tightened and torqued up the joint here. We didn't touch the upper. We've tightened and torqued our suspension brackets, because we need to tighten our axle shaft nut. This is a difficult nut to tighten because you can either have somebody sit in the vehicle and hold on the brakes and try to tighten it against the brake, or you have to come up with some other way to secure this without using a tire. In this case, I've got a long tool wedged between two of the lugs and supported, which allows me to apply torque to the hub without having the wheel turn. And then I can check and verify the torque of that nut. So these are the ball joints that came out of the front end of this thing. And again, the whole reason we replaced these was because of the torn rubber boot here and the nick in the rubber boot on this one. Now in theory, the rubber boots can be replaced. You take the little spring clip off and you can take the other off. However, this ball joint was kind of on the loose side.
That was passenger.
Not terrible, but it's a little floppy. And this has only been in for less than a year. Now, this is the one that had the big tear in the boot. And what's interesting about it is that I can't move it at all. I have to believe that with enough force it would move, but I can't move it at all. And so when you start looking at the inside of it, you see it is full of dirt and crud. This ball joint, if it hadn't failed already, was going to fail. And what's interesting is to have it also be sort of seized up. Makes me wonder if this ball joint hasn't already failed completely. Now, part of the nature of these is they're expected to rotate with the steering. And if it can't rotate, your steering doesn't want to rotate either.
Your hand's moving, but it's hard to see that the stem isn't moving.
Yeah, if you watch the marks on the shaft versus the other one that I can spin. So one of the things that had set us down the path of doing all the work on this Jeep and replacing the steering rack and everything else was it was exhibiting a behavior where every once in a while you go around a corner and it didn't want to return to center, and you had to actively steer the vehicle back. I'm wondering this ball joint may actually have been the root cause of that.
So if we hadn't noticed a torn boot, we wouldn't have replaced that, because that wasn't part of the initial plan.
Nope, was not part of the plan.
And so we would have had the same problem.
Possibly.
Trash is a good place for them.
And the project is done.